Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, Rapier swordsman out of the United States, and today's video is going to be about a footwork technique I use called the false advance. Now the reason for this particular topic is because of late there's been quite a bit of chatter out there as to the precisely how and why I use this footwork technique, and I can tell you it is because it has applicability across the board, across a wide range of situations you may find yourself in with your opponent. As it so happens, at the recent SoCal sword fight this year, I engaged in a fairly lengthy training session with one of my Patreon subscribers. And over the course of that sparring session, the video shows that I was utilizing the false advance a number of times and in a number of different scenarios against my opponent. So I figured I will go ahead and use that training footage in order to answer those questions that you have about the false advance, the how and the why of this particular technique.
Okay, so let's talk about what the false advance actually is. The false advance is just a footwork technique that I use in order to close the distance with my opponent, enough so that I'm going to be able to get the jump on him with the incoming attack without actually triggering their defenses. So as you look here, I'm standing at a pretty much a max distance from my opponent. If I was to lunge, yes, I could hit my opponent. However, lunging from that distance, even with a no-tell lunge, is still giving a lot of time over to my opponent in terms of fencing time because of the fact that I have to travel so much distance in order to reach him. Yes, I can reach him, but in all likelihood, any fencer who's got at least a little bit of experience under their belt is going to have their defenses triggered, and they're going to be able to respond with enough time to thwart my attack. So this is where the false advance comes into play. The false advance is simply a step that I will take. As you can see, as I start to close the distance with my opponent, I reach out with my front foot as though I am making an advance. Now, this does not trigger my opponent's defense. They just simply think that I am taking an advance. It's closing the distance. And the smart opponent, of course, would, in the reaction phase, take a retreat step in order to increase that distance and maintain a good operating measure between the two of us. However, for me, it is actually not an advance step. I reach out with that front foot, as you see here. I start from my beginning position. I reach out on the front foot as though I'm advancing, and then I launch into a full-on lunge that strikes my opponent in the mask. Now, the reason why I was able to make this work is because it allowed me, this false advance, to close the distance in one tempo with my opponent without triggering their defense, and therefore allows me that distance, which is a very capable distance on my part to cover without my opponent being able to get their defenses into place. So again, at speed, it looks a little something like this. But then when we slow that down, it is my opponent is standing in front of me. He's at max distance. I go ahead and reach out with my front foot, making it look like I'm just doing a simple advance. It actually closes the distance to the point that my sword is now close enough that when I launch into a full lunge, it was that last little bit of distance I needed to be able to reach out and strike my opponent without him being able to get his defenses in place in time. So as I mentioned in the intro, this footwork technique called the false advance is something that you can use in a great many different scenarios with your opponent. In this particular instance, look at this example here where I am facing across from my opponent. Now, there's a good amount of space in between us. If I was to launch into even a no-tell attack, he's too far away for me to strike. But as you'll notice, my opponent then gets a little bit comfortable and he steps towards me like so. Now, what you'll notice is he is still a good distance away from me. If I was to go into a full-on extension, I mean, maybe if I'm leaning over at the waist, I might be able to make contact with him, but then that puts you off balance. And as people have heard me say many times, that is not a good position for you to be in. But what he did bring close enough for me to strike, however, is the hand. So in this particular instance, I used the false advance to close with my opponent and then shoot straight into the top of his hand, just like so. So if you're watching me on the left, you'll see that now that my opponent has gotten close enough to me, I take that false advance with the front foot. My back foot, you'll notice, does not move. And then from that position, I launch straight into his hand and take that away from him. At speed, it looks a little something like this. It is a very useful, very effective technique, not just for when you're going for a deep target like the torso or if you're going for the head. You can use this in a great many scenarios, such as the hand, or if you are going for that deep target, or as we'll see in this next example, if I want to take his leg instead. In the first example, I showed you how the false advance can be used in order to strike your opponent in a deep target, whether that be the torso, the head, whatever you prefer. In the second example, I showed you how this exact same footwork technique can allow you to close the distance, keeping your opponent calm and not triggering their defense, so you can strike something as far out in front of them as the hand. Well, you can also do this against your opponent's leg, but in this particular scenario, you're going to see me actually combine the false advance with a ruse in order to get my opponent to move their sword out of the way. As I said, this is applicable across a wide range of scenarios you could find yourself in. And here, I start combining a different technique with the footwork in order to make it such that I can strike my opponent. So you see here, the distance between myself and my opponent is very great. So as my opponent closes the distance, they get comfortable enough, they want to try and strike me. They bring that first target, the knee, close enough that if I could actually close just a little bit of distance without triggering my opponent to retreat or to get their sword moving in a defensive action, I can still hit it from that distance, but I gotta close just a little bit more to make it such that I can hit him with no resistance whatsoever. So in this, I utilize the false advance. So here you see, my hand comes up, I am preparing to make that attack. He doesn't know that. My front foot comes out on the false advance. Then you'll notice I'm raising my sword in order to get my opponent to raise his weapon out of the way. I want to shoot the knee, and I want his defensive mechanism, that sword, to be as far away from the target I'm actually shooting for as possible. So then, with my sword up, his sword raises, and then down I shoot into the knee, striking, no problem. Now, this is only because of the false advance as a footwork technique. It allows me to be able to close distance without triggering my opponent's defensive instincts. So this time, let's talk about an even more complex combination that utilizes the false advance. Now, in this scenario, my opponent has already been struck in the leg a couple of times, so he's wary about the fact that his knee has been vulnerable. So I decide to take advantage of that. As you see here, again, we've got a goodly amount of distance between the two of us, but this time I'm going to combine the false advance, which is a footwork technique, with another footwork technique in order to surprise my opponent. So here we start off. My opponent has got the distance between us. It's a fairly goodly amount of distance, and I have to close that if I want to be able to strike him without triggering his defense. But first, here comes the false advance. The foot comes out, and then I combine it with a balestra, where I leap in, and I've covered a lot of ground now. It surprises my opponent, and as you'll see by his reaction, he thinks it's a shot to the leg because my sword is low. He pulls his legs back, which puts him off balance and brings his head forward, in which time I then shoot up, stringier the blade on the way in, strike him in the mask, and keep his sword safely away from my body during the entirety of this action. At speed, it looks a little something like this. Again, real quick, the first thing that happens is the false advance, and then once that lands, I utilize a balestra to close the distance, surprising my opponent, which triggers him to try and defend his leg, pulling his leg away, which leaves his head forward, and then I shoot from there, stringier his blade, strike him in the mask, and I am safe the entire time of this exchange, and I closed the distance quickly without my opponent ever realizing it until it was too late. One of the first things any new student of mine is going to learn is the lunge, and not just any lunge, but the notel lunge. Now, this is just a blade technique that allows you to get your sword out front. It is the first thing that moves, and then once you get to that extension as far as you need to get, then the body moves in order to complete that lunge. The notel lunge is a technique that I use, and it has a very specific purpose. But not every situation calls for the no-tail lunge. And in this particular case, the use of the false advance, this is one of those scenarios that is usually not going to require, in fact, usually requires that you not move the sword out first. And the reason for that is such. Now, if you look in this example right here, again, we have that distance between my opponent and myself. And in this particular instance, I am going to reach forward on that false advance, the first step that comes out there. And then you'll notice that at that particular moment, my opponent just happened to decide to attack at that exact same time. Now, because of the fact that over the course of the sequence of the false advance, it's going to be that false advance followed immediately by the attack that comes after that. But in the middle of that sequence is when my opponent just happens to decide to attack. But because I moved the sword and the body at the same time, I'm keeping my body behind that sword, I am able instead, as I'm going through the second part of that sequence, instead of attacking him, I see his sword is coming forward and I instead engage his weapon with a parry. Then after that, I reach forward and strike him in the mask. Now, if I had at first done a no-tail lunge with the false advance, what would have happened is that he probably would have struck me as I was striking him, which in a martial context is not a good scenario to be in. As you can see here, at the moment that I have actually struck him in the mask, if I had done a no-tail lunge at the start of this sequence, what you would have seen is my sword is up high because I'm trying to strike him in the mask, while my opponent's sword was down low. What would have happened then? Maybe I would have seen his attack in time to try and react to it, but with my sword well up high and his sword starting down low, that is a lot of distance that I would have had to cover in order to try and intercept his blade and keep him from being able to strike me at the same time that I would have otherwise struck him. When you are utilizing the false advance, in most scenarios, I am utilizing this when my sword is on the same level as my opponent's. If my opponent has a mid guard to low guard when I begin the false advance sequence, I am going to move my sword and body at the same time so I can keep my body safely behind my weapon. In this particular instance, it paid off because of the fact that he just happened to decide to attack me as I was going into the second part of my attack, which was the actual lunge itself. If I had started with a no-tail lunge, my sword reaching out there first, he probably would have struck me at the same time. But because I moved them both together, when he decided to attack me, I was instead able to engage his weapon. Then once it's safely parried out of the way and he's trying to desperately get out of the way, I'm able to reach out and finally hit him in the target that I was intending to in the first place. Lastly, I will wrap this up by showing you yet again a very complex combination that we executed between my opponent and I, and all of it was founded upon that false advance that allowed me to get close enough to my opponent without engaging his defenses. Now, in this scenario here, you're going to see me do a couple of footwork techniques, followed by some sword techniques, followed by some tactical strategies, all of which I will spell out over the course of this particular example. So here you see me moving with a regular advance forward towards my opponent. Now, as already mentioned, when you do this, your opponent is not going to view this as a threat, and in all likelihood, because of the fact that you have closed distance, they will then try to open that distance, as my opponent is doing here, very smartly so, in order to maintain a good operating distance. The very next thing that I do is the false advance. Here you see my foot come out, but instead of going for a launch straight into the body, I am instead now incorporating a two-target concept. If you're not already familiar with that, go ahead and see another video on the YouTube channel covering the two-target concept, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. But I utilize the false advance here in order to do a capture of his weapon and push it out of the way. Now, predictably, this causes my opponent to freak out a little bit and desperately try to increase the distance between us. And that is the moment, as he's doing that I shoot forward and strike him in the mask. But also, if you're in a HEMA context, you want to make sure that you're the only person being struck. So the smart thing to do is to try and parry that shot that's coming in that would normally be constituting an afterblow. In this instance, I follow through by parrying that afterblow. And then once again, I come back at him, cutting him to the mask, finishing with 2 shots to deep targets, all because I was able to close the distance with my opponent. At speed, it looks a little something like this. And all of that began with me coming forward with an advance, showing my opponent that I mean no threat, and then follow that up with that foundational footwork tactic of the false advance, which allowed me to close the distance without startling my opponent until such time as it was too late for him to realize it was actually the beginning of a whole sequence of attacks.
So I hope you found that information useful. Again, the false advance is something that is widely applicable. It is a great resource for you in order to be able to close the distance with your opponent, that last little bit of distance you need in order to be able to close the distance on an attack with your opponent without triggering their defenses. But if you have any further questions on this, please feel free to reach out to me. I am not difficult to get a hold of. You can ask your questions on the YouTube channel, or if you're one of my Patreon subscribers, of course, you can ask me through there. And who knows, maybe I'll even do a follow-on video if there is enough interest and questions following on. In the meantime, I hope you all are training hard, and I look forward to seeing you all at a tournament sometime soon.